really happy to be here today. So thank you all for having me. As you heard the good doctor say, I'm from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States. And I wanted to bring that up again because I think it's important for people to understand that the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency has the responsibilities sort of right there in the title. But we are not a regulator and we are not a law enforcement agency. So we have sort of limited authorities for what we can do to improve the cybersecurity and the resilience of the infrastructure, of critical infrastructure in the United States. And we've been looking very hard at what we can try to do to improve the ransomware situation for quite a long time. Or as you mentioned, 12 months ago, right? This was a priority for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, but not necessarily something that was on CISA's radar. We would often find out about a ransomware situation, and we'd try to send the best of our best, either vulnerability assessment teams or our hunt and incident response teams. We'd send them on site to help. For example, the city of Baltimore was hit by a big ransomware attack a few years ago, and so we'd send our best people. And come to find out, it's basically like you're hanging around, sort of like you got offline backups. Can you get those restored? Do they work properly? And you're sort of you're waiting for the operator, the owner operator of the network, to do their thing, get themselves healthy again, then try to make sure that you've actually eradicated the threat and that you've prevented the possibility of them getting back in again and re-ransoming you, for example, which wasn't a really high impact activity for us to be engaged in. So we were thinking, it's more useful for law enforcement to tackle this, or it's not necessarily a high priority for CISA at this time. And then over time, as these things became more prevalent, obviously it became a big priority for us, and we had to get creative about the ways we were going to try to improve the readiness of the nation, and improve our ability to help other people help themselves prevent ransomware from occurring in the first place. So what I'd like to start to do today is to show examples of the resources we made available and show you some of our work that CISA is doing in the United States. And the benefit of this is that it's not just a sales pitch for our free stuff. Well, it kind of is, but this free stuff is for everybody. So I hope that the organizations on this webinar today, or on this, participating in this panel today, can all take a look at these. I'm going to give you a guided tour of our publicly available resources, and you can see which ones might be applicable to you and how you can potentially benefit from them, because we're making them available, like I said, for everybody. So one thing we did was we created a one-stop shop for all of our ransomware resources, guidance. This was basically the result of White House priorities. The Biden administration came in, made ransomware the #1 cyber priority in the United States, and it became immediately apparent that CISA needed to take the lead on the prevention aspect, the prevention and protection aspect, while FBI remains the lead for investigation and trying to bust the adversary. Now, so this is accessible if you just go to. Oh, good. Everybody gets to see my my bookmarks. Stopransomware.gov. It redirects you right here. So that's really easy to remember. And this has resources for dealing with an attack after the effect. This has resources for preparing yourself so you're more ready. We also created campaigns for particular target sets. So if you go to resources, there's tons of stuff here. And I do apologize, this is a government website with tons of stuff, so it's kind of an info dump. That's the value of the guided tour. On campaigns, we created resources specifically for kindergarten through 12th grade, because we were really worried about our students' networks and their ability to continue learning, and we knew that these could be a target as well. And we also created healthcare, because I was recently part of the CISA COVID task force, helping ensure the cyber resiliency of all the organizations involved in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I've just come off that task force, and that was a huge problem for us, was trying to make sure that all of our healthcare delivery organizations and hospital networks in the United States were protected. So we created resources for them. I also want to show you this guide. This is our one-stop shop guide that we developed with our multi-state information sharing and analysis center. Those are our partners who help us oversee the cybersecurity of our state, local, territorial, and tribal governments within the United States. So there's tons of stuff in this guide. The first part, ransomware prevention best practices, very detailed, goes into things like, the infection vectors, types of best practices and hardening guidance. You can see all of that here. But my favorite part, oh good, we're getting loading screens. Wow, this is really like a live demo, isn't it, folks? Okay. The second part is the really valuable part, which is the checklist. The incident response checklist is everything you need to do to be ready and prepared, and tells you all about how to start isolating systems, and also contains information on what to do in the immediate, immediate aftermath. I love this contact information page. We've also created something very similar specifically for healthcare, but this is really important. You talked about sharing information. You talked about how people aren't necessarily letting us know when a ransomware attack hits. This is how we want to encourage more people to do that, because we realize CISA has the same problem. We have very low visibility into the true number of ransomware attacks affecting critical infrastructure in the United States, because unless it makes headlines, or unless somebody has to report a data breach per state and local laws, we're not necessarily finding out about it. So basically, we tell people like, hey, you can always contact CISA if you're in the United States, of course, and you can always contact the FBI. So this is a great checklist for incident response that we are hoping to promulgate and get more and more people to follow. We also created this, and this is a way of, I like to say, this is a way of keeping people from becoming that low-hanging fruit that ransomware threat actors love to exploit. And this is a really short list of things you should never do. This is the opposite of best practices. These are bad practices. These are things that if you are doing these things, you need to stop doing them right now, especially if they're exposed to the internet, especially if you're using them in critical infrastructure applications. And we have 3 simple things right now: using unsupported or end-of-life software, using known, fixed, or default passwords and credentials, and using single-factor authentication for RDP, basically, remote or administrative access. All these things we know are ways for easily getting owned by a ransomware threat actor. So we want people to stop doing those immediately. And we're hoping that this information actually feeds into our sister agencies that do have regulatory authority, or even into cyber insurance practices. Because if cyber insurers start saying, hey, you're doing a bad practice, your policy is invalid, then we know it's really got some more authority than we can give it by ourselves. 2 more things, and then I promise I'm done. I don't know how like I might be eating up my time. We also created Stuff Off Search, which originally had a slightly less professional name. But this is a guide to getting all your stuff, your Internet of Things devices, your maybe your outdated server software, but anything you can find on a search engine like Shodan or census.io, taking it so that it's hidden, or at least that it's up to date, or whatever you need to know to ensure that your stuff is not visible from the most cursory of searches that an adversary can do, right? Make them have to do some real reconnaissance for once, right? Don't make it so easy for them. So we also created this and are trying to, again, trying to get the word out as much as we possibly can about this guidance so that people can follow it. And we have a free tool. This is a self-assessment tool. And we created a ransomware readiness assessment module for it. That's our newest release. It's available on GitHub. It's standalone. And so basically you download this and you run it in your own time whenever you can have, a free moment to do a self-assessment of your cybersecurity readiness. And we've gotten a lot of good feedback about this latest ransomware readiness module. So we're really excited for this one as well. And lastly, This is the mandatory sign up for our alerts encouragement. Again, everybody in the world can sign up for this stuff. It's freely available to everyone. It's intended for the public at large. And this is used to be the old US CERT page before US CERT became part of CISA, and we were all sort of absorbed into the greater organization, which was a great thing. I was part of US CERT since 2007, and I couldn't be prouder to be part of CISA today. And unfortunately, this is a little design factor that I probably wouldn't have agreed upon had I been consulted, but I was not. They put the subscription thing at the bottom. So you have to scroll all the way down, and then you can sign up for our alerts. So you can put your security operations center's email distro or inbox on this. You can put your own, whatever you need to know, and you can sign up for all the different types of alerts, bulletins, tips, and our analysis reports that we make freely available to everyone. And these are really valuable for just general situational awareness of the threat, whether that be from ransomware or something else. But we have put out some really valuable ransomware tips that we produced in conjunction with the FBI, and even in conjunction with the FBI and other sister agencies, discussing ransomware threats and sharing important indicators of compromise so people can better defend themselves. So those are all the things we're trying to do to tackle this threat from our sort of, from the CISA perspective. Again, not a regulator, not law enforcement. So what do we have to do? We have the power of the megaphone, is what I like to say. So we want to get as much information out to our critical infrastructure partners and stakeholders as we possibly can, and then help them follow that guidance, right? Feedback is really important. Understanding how people are able to use our guidance or aren't able to use it. So even down to the bad practices, we want to encourage a conversation around those bad practices to find out where in critical infrastructure is it actually a difficult conversation to stop doing these bad practices. We know there are places in our country where either because of budgetary or resource constraints or just system architecture, that it's going to be really hard to get past employing the sort of practices that make you low-hanging fruit for these adversaries. And we want to have that conversation. So I will cede the rest of my time, sir, to questions.
First of all, I'd like to thank the RSIS Center for Excellence for National Security for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I think this is a very timely session, given the changes to the global cyber threat landscape and the prevalent use of ransomware and attacks that we have seen globally here in Singapore. I think my comments, I will be very complimentary to Tom's comments. I think he's gone deep down. Let me just go back up and give a perspective, a wider perspective. Let me start by first stating why ransomware is, in my view, rising to a level of a national security threat. Ransomware attacks aren't new. In the past, attacks tended to be isolated, sporadic, typically affecting individuals, SMEs, a handful of computers. But however, there's been clearly what I would say a step change in ransomware attacks in two ways. First, there's been a step change in scale. Cyber criminal gangs have refined their tactics, and they now encrypt or lock up hundreds, if not thousands, of computers simultaneously. And they increasingly target large companies and organizations which they believe will pay a bigger ransom to end the pain if operations are sufficiently disrupted and enough damage is caused. Second step change is the impact. The impact of ransomware attacks is no longer contained in the digital domain. They now spill over into the physical realm, and there are real-world consequences. We've seen this globally with the recent uptick in international ransomware attacks. In May, Colonial Pipeline Company, operating the largest fuel pipeline on the east coast of the US, suffered a ransomware attack. This prompted the company to shut down the pipeline's operations for close to a week, and it affected the supply of fuel to 50 million customers. In the middle of May, New Zealand and Ireland, their healthcare services suffered from separate ransomware attacks. The shutdown of affected IT systems led to surgeries being postponed and outpatient services suspended because patient records had become inaccessible. And earlier this month, it was reported that the Justice Ministry of the South African government was hit by a ransomware attack, which encrypted all of its systems, making its electronic services totally unavailable. This included bail services, the issuance of court letters, and even the disbursement of child maintenance payments. These attacks are stark reminders of the damage and the mayhem that ransomware attacks can cause. This points to the need for all of us to remain vigilant against them. This includes not just public agencies delivering essential services, but private organizations as well, so long as they depend on IT systems for any part of their core business. Singapore hasn't been spared. The ransomware trend in Singapore mirrors the global landscape. We've seen a sharp increase in ransomware incidents over the years. More than a fourfold increase in incidents reported from 2018 to 2020. The numbers that I have are from 21 cases to 89 cases. And the first half of 2021, we have 68 cases reported to the Singapore Police Force and the Singapore Computer Emergency Response Team, SIGCERT. These cases are just the tip of the iceberg. They are only the reported cases. It's likely that there are more cases that have gone unreported. The threat actors involved in the ransomware ecosystem has also evolved over time. It used to be vertically integrated. Today, the ecosystem is a complex one. It comprises a myriad of players. They take on different roles. Some are the ransomware operators, some are affiliates, some are the developers of the software. The affiliates work under a ransomware as a service model for the operators. You've got different things, software as a service. You've got also ransomware as a service. This ransomware as a service model has led to an entire self-sustaining shadow industry that's supporting this ransomware ecosystem. It provides services such as selling access to corporate networks, money laundering, etc. This is a worrying development. The RAAS model replaces ransomware capabilities in the hands, places ransomware capabilities in the hands of anyone who has the intent to cause disruption and the financial means to procure the service, even if they didn't have the technical capabilities to do it organically. Our view is that we can no longer view ransomware as a mere nuisance. The change in scale and impact of ransomware attacks means that we have to start viewing it as a national security threat and addressing it as such, taking a holistic view of the issues surrounding it. I said, and Sashi mentioned, that if you had asked me 12, 18 months ago, I wasn't that aware, and many of my international counterparts weren't that aware of ransomware. Because primarily, as Tom said, it was a law enforcement issue. It hit single-digit computers, etc. But once we are reaching this scale, then agencies like mine have to take an interest. It is a national security issue. It has significant impact on the security and the economy of our countries. So we have four broad objectives when we think about countering the global threat of ransomware. Two of them are domestic aspects and two are international aspects. First, we need to help domestic organizations prepare for ransomware attacks. This refers to putting in place protection measures against ransomware and raising the cyber posture for both critical information infrastructure owners as well as the wider cyberspace. So the examples that Tom walked you through, I think would fit perfectly under this pillar. The agency which I lead, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, CSA, took proactive steps to safeguard our CIIs, and we directed the CII sectors to put in place measures like enhancing the monitoring to detect anomalous activity, backing up data regularly, and obviously to keep the backups offline, practicing incident response and business continuity plans to make sure that employees actually know what to do in a response to a ransomware attack. It's like having a fire drill. You need to practice the fire drill. These are on top of existing cyber resilience measures that already mandated for critical information infrastructure sectors under Singapore's Cybersecurity Act. We are cognizant that these attacks can strike any of us or our organization. So we need to do what we can to prevent breaches. But we also monitor for and detect these incidents so that we can quickly recover from them. CSA has issued public advisories on the steps that companies, organizations, and members of the public should take to protect themselves against the ransomware threat. Many of them are simple cyber hygiene measures, such as keeping systems, software updated, raising employees' awareness of ransomware, monitoring and detecting cyber intrusions swiftly, and backing up the data. These are important steps that can contain the impact of any ransomware attack. These efforts must be accompanied by effective public communications to encourage the adoption of cybersecurity measures among the bosses, the C-suites, companies, and the individuals. The second thrust is to respond to ransomware attacks more effectively. This involves exploring how we can increase support for ransomware victims or soon-to-be victims so that we can help the victims recover from an attack and publish updates. We publish updates on ransomware tactics to help the public defend themselves better. One way is to encourage victims to tap on No More Ransom initiative, which was led by Europol, the Netherlands, Kaspersky, and McAfee. This provides victims with open source decryption tools to unlock their data after a ransomware attack. Third, we need to deter ransomware attacks through an internationally coordinated strategy. We recognize that as a small country, we can't address the ransomware threat by ourselves. It's a global threat. We have to work with our international partners to move the global conversation, and not just looking at counterparts who are cybersecurity counterparts, but also looking at the finance sector and law enforcement, of course. This will involve identifying the pain points and difficulties faced in tackling ransomware and securing international consensus on the ways and means to address these pain points and difficulties. One possible area is the need to raise the capacity of states to tackle the ransomware scourge. We're happy to work with like-minded partners on this. Fourth, and finally, we need to disrupt the ransomware business model. As I said, it's become an entire ecosystem. So we need to disrupt this business model and reduce criminal profits. This trust is related to my third point that we can't do this alone. So we have to work with partners to prevent and deter ransomware criminals. One key avenue is looking into disrupting the payment of ransoms. The Singapore government's position is that we do not recommend the payment of ransom if one falls victim to a ransomware attack. These attackers are criminals. The payment of a ransom does not guarantee that the victim will be able to restore the systems, or that the data will be decrypted as promised, or that the data that was stolen won't be published and released eventually. This speaks to the concept of double extortion, where the criminal demands ransom to decrypt the data, and he also demands ransom again for the victim's data not to be leaked online. The payment of ransom also encourages the criminals to continue their malicious activities, and they will target more victims. Cyber criminals may also view organizations that have already paid up as a soft target, and they may in due course attack them again. To achieve the objective of disrupting the business model and to reduce criminal profits, one way is to work with the finance sector to prevent ransoms from reaching the ransomware criminals through virtual currencies. This should involve implementing things like anti-money laundering and countering the finance of terrorism, AML, CFT regulations, and minimize the risk of virtual asset service providers being exploited by criminals to launder illicit proceeds or hide their illicit assets. This should be in line with Global Financial Action Task Force, FATF standards. We also need to explore how we may leverage cyber insurance to achieve the desired cybersecurity outcomes. For example, cyber insurance providers could support enterprises to raise their cybersecurity posture before they are insured, just like Tom mentioned earlier. This would go a long way to protect them against ransomware attacks. It involves working with insurance companies, enterprises, as well as our international partners. This leads me to my final point, which is the need for us to work together in three ways. Firstly, in a cross-border manner, there is a need for discussions among countries to collectively arrive at an agreement or an approach to tackle ransomware. This can be done at international settings like the United Nations or regionally, like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Second, it needs to be a multi-stakeholder manner to share information, coordinate the policies needed to mitigate the ransomware threat. States alone do not have all the solutions. We need the support of the private sector, the tech industry, academia, non-government organizations to co-develop the ideas to tackle ransomware. And third, it needs to be done in a cross-domain manner. Ransomware is not just a cybersecurity issue. It's not a technical issue. It's an issue that involves the finance sector, law enforcement authorities that we together have to grapple with. Stakeholders in the various domains need to talk to one another. We need to discuss what kind of solutions or levers are possible. We need to work together. We have to take a network approach rather than a siloed one. If you think about it, the ransomware criminals are working across borders. They are coordinating among themselves in their own ecosystem. So we, the defenders, we have to similarly work across borders. We have to have a multi-stakeholder approach so that we can cross the silos and they can collectively strengthen our cyber defenses. Well, so this is why I think that today's webinar and the diverse lineup of panelists from governments, academia, NGO sector is important to start this conversation so that we can co-create the solutions for the ransomware threat. Thanks very much, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the RSIS Centre for inviting me to speak this evening. It's great to virtually be here. Look, I feel that now I'm just going to be sort of saying a bit of what Tom and David said, and I think sadly for all of the speakers it will be a familiar story. But as David said, for us in Australia, the ransomware story is no different. And I think that's probably germane to what we're all speaking about today. We live in a highly connected world. So this is a threat to Singapore, and a threat to the US can equally just as easily be a threat to Australia, because cyber criminals target wherever they can get money. And in my view, and in fact, Dmitry Alperovich, who now runs his own Silverado policy think tank, but was the former CTO of CrowdStrike, wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times yesterday, talking about taking back control and suggesting that the US should be really using not offensive capabilities, but taking an offensive stance, and that diplomacy is not enough. So I'll just touch on a couple of those points. But absolutely, we now live in a highly connected world where once 10 or 15 years ago, and 20 years ago, documents we would have just stored in filing cabinets and on paper are now stored online in the cloud. And in fact, almost all of our valuable data is stored somewhere. So ransomware has become one of the most immediate and high impact threats to cyber threats to Australia. As David mentioned, cyber criminals are incredibly agile. They've always worked from home. And in fact, COVID was nothing new for them. It just allowed them to, in fact, think of different ways to send out ransomware lures and different ways to entrap and steal and extort data. Increasingly, ransomware attacks, as we're seeing, are accompanied by extortion demands requiring payment of a ransom, often in Bitcoin, and will to decrypt and prevent publication of stolen data. So now we're seeing not just ordinary ransomware, as we did maybe 1 or 2 years ago. We're now seeing that extortion tail, because the extortion, if you like, almost keeps the victims, I won't say honest, it keeps them in a position where they can't actually, it's not encouraged they lie. In my experience, prior to ransomware, you would often see organisations being victims of data breaches, but the traditional line that they would often run in the media was, and this could have been true, was that there was no evidence that data had been exfiltrated or stolen. My experience, having been in the area and as a lawyer, it's very uncommon for robbers to, in the real world, to enter a house, look around and decide there's nothing to steal. So I think the ransomware threat actors decided that they, I think, would give that line a run for its money, and by extorting the victim and saying we've actually taken a copy. And when companies did come out and say that they really hadn't been a victim or they hadn't had data stolen, there were some cases where they actually said, this is incorrect, and we'll tell you why. So it's a very nasty tale, that extortion tale. For Australia, the Australian Cyber Security Centre just recently, last week, released its annual report, and they said there were 500 cases that had been reported in the last financial year. In my view, that's probably an underreported number, because we all know it's a very underreported crime. In Australia, it is not compulsory for any organisation to report that they've been a victim of any cybercrime, and certainly not ransomware. And it is certainly not compulsory for them to say whether they have paid a ransom. And in fact, in a recent policy paper that my centre that I wrote with a colleague of mine, we suggested one of the changes to Australian law was that it become a civil obligation for companies to have mandatory reporting of ransomware, certainly root cause, so that it wasn't just reported into a big bucket, but that we could learn how organisations, what the root cause was of them being hit by ransomware, and then if they paid a ransom on an anonymous basis. It certainly wasn't to name and shame the victims. But of course, unfortunately, ransomware requires minimal technical expertise, it's low cost, and it can result in a significant impact to organisations. We're finding here in Australia, just like the rest of the world, the business models continue to evolve. They focus on getting bigger targets and having larger ransoms paid. So they'll do anything that they can do to leverage their profits. As noted here on previous speakers, it's very difficult to investigate and prosecute criminals responsible for ransomware. That's why cross-jurisdictional cooperation really matters. And we all know that for many of the threat actors, they are in jurisdictions that are simply not friendly in terms of extradition or even indictments. So they operate often with impunity in countries that protect them, or simply ignore our legal systems and don't have any extradition system to bring them to justice. We're finding ransomware attackers will often not only use extortion, but release that data on the dark web. And I thought, Tom, particularly CISIS tools are incredibly valuable across a range of organisations and for a range of reasons, but certainly for organisations seeing what data has been stolen and placed on the dark web. I know of organisations that have part of their remediation and cleanup is regularly checking the dark web. And that's simply, again, in my view, putting the victim in a position where they're constantly mopping up. So anything that can be done, I think, from a government perspective to work to make it much harder for ransomware threat actors to not only find victims, which they're very good at finding, but also making it much harder for them to operate, which is also what David mentioned. I'll mention that in a moment. My view is exactly the same. We need to start to regulate cryptocurrency so that the same know your customer and other rules that are in place for normal monetary transactions also operate in the crypto world, because it will then make it much harder for money laundering and the money to simply be paid via third parties to ransomware threat actors. I think the other part of this puzzle that's not often talked about is the role of cyber insurance. And in fact, my centre, we're about to release another paper on this. Cyber insurance in Australia is in a relatively immature offering, but many organisations do hold some form of cyber insurance. And we are seeing that whilst it's a very small offering here in Australia, it is a product that is on the rise, partly because some organisations believe they just need to have it as part of a way of managing cyber risk. What we found in our research, though, was that many cyber insurance offerers offer to pay a ransom. They call it extortion payments, cyber extortion payments. And in my view, this is dangerous because it feeds an economy of ransomware. And it also provides a false sense of security for the customer who's taking out the ransomware insurance. In our experience, we found that there was no perpetuating cycle for cyber insurance providers to actually ensure uplift, and they also didn't have to be clear about whether they denied cover at all. I think, like David said, there is an absolute clear role for cyber insurance to play, particularly in the SME market, to play in uplifting cybersecurity posture for organisations, and even if they offer cover, to say how they could be even more, how they could reduce their premiums by ensuring that SMEs and organisations who take cover take all sorts of steps to become even more resilient. I think that is absolutely critical, especially when it comes to the simple things organisations can do to at least ensure that they're not as much of a target, or if they are a target, that they are actually up and running and they're not reliant on paying vast amounts of money in order to get their data back. In Australia, we also argue that the legal implications of paying a ransom make it tough at the moment. It's not clear in Australia whether payment of ransom is unlawful. So we have a situation where it could be considered, payment could be considered instrument of crime within the provisions of our criminal code. and the defences available at the moment are narrow. So we believe that there's a role for the Australian government to play in really coming out and providing clarity about, similar to the US, where they may say, we're not going to prosecute, we prefer you don't pay. The Australian government position is do not pay the ransom, but we prefer they say do not pay the ransom. Here's the reasons why. If you absolutely needed to, we would not prosecute in certain situations, and they could designate critical infrastructure. I think the legal implications, and that also is for payment of ransom, not helped when cyber insurance companies will agree to pay the ransom as well, because they're still perpetuating this sort of cycle that, in my view, is slightly murky when it comes to actual payment of ransom. It doesn't matter whether it's a third party who's paid it, it's still in the chain when it comes to that organisation. And I think for us, the implications, the board implications for payment of ransom, you can often have a situation where boards have to cede control of a cyber incident, a ransomware incident, to the cyber insurer. It means that they do not often get a say in how it's managed. And in some cases, there could be an implication of shadow directors. So again, another issue that is sort of not considered in the overall sort of scourge of ransomware. I think it's vitally important that we disrupt the models for ransomware, and that's countries working together, as has been mentioned. It's disrupting models of cryptocurrency. It's disrupting models in how they work, and working out how the role of cyber insurance. But it's clear to me that there are, as Dmitry Alperovich argued in his New York Times op-ed yesterday, there are clear models, like in the US, where they disrupted ISIL online operations. There are models where governments could be disruptive, but it's clear to me, and obviously and I'll finish up, obviously the title of this webinar is salient, because it's about, what can we do? My view is companies can't fight this alone. It's really tough. There are things they can do to certainly not be easy victims, absolutely. And we want them all to do that, but it's very difficult for small businesses, and it's even hard for big businesses that have a large attack surface. So I think there's a clear role for government. It is not government's problem to own 100%, but there's a clear role for government and a clear role for private enterprise and a clear role for individuals in understanding as employees what they need to do every day to sort of minimise the risk. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure. The concept I would like to develop here, and building on what has been said before by the colleagues, is how to look at ransomware from the point of view of it's a threat, it's a systemic threat that is increasing the vulnerability gap across the board, meaning that the ones that are the most vulnerable today when it comes to attack are becoming more vulnerable. So that's one of the effects. And the second part is that ransomware has deep societal impact. Just to introduce the Cyber Peace Institute, why we look into this, because our mission, so we are a NGO, we are based in Geneva, non-for-profits, and our mission is to protect the ones with the least capacity to protect themselves. So vulnerable communities. And in these vulnerable communities, one of the focus is to provide for free support to NGOs. And it's a bit what Tom was saying before. It's also, we are not law enforcement, but we have the capacity to share the stories and the impact of what is happening to this community in order to make sure that the rest of the community, namely, industry in one hand, but most importantly, policymakers, states, takes action of scale in order to change what is happening. So I would like to in fact share something that I was just doing just now when preparing. But if you make a simple Google search on WannaCry, this is what you find. And if you make a simple Google search on Kaseya, something a bit more recent, this is what you find. What you don't see in both pictures is the face of a human being. So it's like these attacks are impacting, screens, network, computers, something like this. But what we found out in the Institute is that as long as we don't go into the societal impact of these threats, what is happening to people, what is happening in the long run, is very difficult then to have a case in order to have systemic and long-lasting changes. So that's really the angle that we're taking. And I will make a specific focus on NGOs, and you will understand, I guess, why we are focusing on supporting NGOs. So NGOs is very linked when it comes to activities with crisis in the world. And with the crisis that we are facing now, I mean, the level, for example, of extreme poverty is just in jeopardy, and this depends on critical services, and a lot of them are offered by NGOs. So it's not critical infrastructure, clearly not, but you have NGOs that are active in access to food, access to water, facilitating access to vaccine, helping with access to healthcare a lot in the fight of COVID-19. And these NGOs are, in fact, depends on donation, clearly. And these donation are, maybe it's not known from the community, but is raising over a good 30 billion annually. And if we don't know, in fact, cyber criminals, they do know, clearly. So these NGOs are facing a double threat. And when it comes to their business model, because they are having quite a budget for some of them, or not even a lot for some of them, but they have a gold that is sought by attackers, which is personal data, sensitive data, because of the activity that they have in the field. They are managing sometimes, activists, specific beneficiaries. So even if their budget is not high, what they hold as information has a lot of value. And they became a prey of choice for criminal groups and or state actors. So, and this is in a situation, and I go back to the vulnerability comments, where already NGOs in this example are quite vulnerable. So only 1 in 10 are training staff on cyber. I mean, 3 out of 4 monitor regularly the network, and 4 out of 5 don't have a plan, to recover from attacks. And you put this, and I like what Tom and David opened with, and all the examples provided by the colleagues, is that if you put this into the sophistication of the ransomware modus operandi that is becoming more sophisticated at scale, affiliation, ransomware as a service, we move from I'm going to encrypt your system and you have to pay, to you don't pay, I don't care that you don't pay because I stole your data. So I'm going to put your data online. You still don't pay, I don't care that you don't pay because I'm going then to ransom each and every of the data subject, we saw that in Finland, in order to make them pay, and then you're going to be liable. So there's a scale of increase in criminal sophistication versus what you can see on this slide, at least for the vulnerable communities, and NGOs is a good way to look at it, quite limited capacity to defend. So for attackers, it's easy attacks, it's low risk, and it's big payout. And that's where we see that ransomware is having a specific role in this context. So what do we do in the Cyber Peace Institute in order to help the community? So we have a program that we put in place in order to address what we feel are the need of the NGOs in terms of training, in terms of managing IT budget, selecting the right tools, ensuring a proper IT and IT security governance. And this program is called the Cyber Peace Builders, where we understood that from the community, especially in the private sector, there's an appetite to help. So sometimes the appetite is there, the ambition is there, but the how to help is missing. So what we provide as a platform, independent and neutral, is securing volunteering in this cooperation. So support, practical support with different cybersecurity profiles. It could be from your cybersecurity threat hunter to someone that is more into architecture, another one that is more into data protection. So skills and willingness to help the most vulnerable. And we make sure that on the other end, we have beneficiaries that are getting the support that they need in this dear situation. So that's something very practical that we launched already last year in the specific scope of healthcare, and I will go back to healthcare as a second example of vulnerable communities. So in the context of healthcare, we launched the Cyber for Healthcare program, where we could match real-time during the pandemic beneficiaries in need of help and corporate capabilities in order to help them. So that's it's a very practical way in order to scale up resilience. And then I will go specifically to healthcare as another way to look into this. What is ransomware doing as deep, long-lasting societal impacts to attacks. In the institute, and here I cannot see my screen anymore. What's happening? Here it's great better. Okay. In the institute, we looked into the threat on healthcare, and where is that? No, ransom. I put that. Yeah, we issued an ethical report some months ago in order to look at the threat from the point of view of what is happening to healthcare professionals, what is happening to patients, and how can you scale up the response looking at this. So that's an extract of the report. I just wanted to show you something here, which is, I think, interesting for when colleagues are looking, how to address the threats. It was a lot asked here. How do we address that? So the way we look at this is to say, you have at the center of everything the victims, the targets. And then we were building the analytical reports on the way up, meaning these targets, healthcare professionals, patients, they are attacked by specific modus operandi. It can be ransomware, but also espionage, but also misinformation. At the end of the day, this is the same victims, they are the ones suffering. And then you go one level up. Who are the actors doing these attacks? From criminal groups to state actors, and the one in between, the one working for the other or facilitated by the other. And then we went one level up, which is quite important, is the legal and normative instrument. It was mentioned before, is that what is the law that kicks in this context? If you want to go for accountability, to see who is accountable to do what. And we really felt doing this in the healthcare, and the same methodology can be used in other sectors, is quite useful, because then you can go for practical recommendation to states, to the industry, to the healthcare sector, to civil society, recommendation for us, how to better help. And that's why we put in place some practical capabilities to help the community, because with this kind of analysis, you see, okay, what is happening to people and what can be helpful for them. So I'm putting this in the open. You can find this on the website of the Cyber Peace Institute. It's a free resources. Something else that goes back to what Tom was mentioning in the beginning, we also put in place some collection of best practices that are out there in terms of, defense to protect yourself, securing others. So you'll find this on the Cyber Peace Institute website if you search for toolkits. And here we collected some very, very good initiative, very good projects, because the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, is not to pretend that because you're there and then you're going to redo everything. A lot is done already. And David before mentioned normal ransom. Normal ransom is an amazing project. I just opened the window here while David, thank you for flagging, you mentioning it. It's a must go to resources if someone is under attack. You're under attack, you go there, and there's a chance that you're going to find, the key to decrypt your information. So, and at least you can understand a bit what is happening there. So we felt, and I go back to the NGOs because it's good to discuss with the beneficiaries with a very deeply rooted humanitarian mission, with the need to be efficient, with sometimes little budget, very little ICT capacity, and understanding what you can give to these communities for them to secure themselves. Because if you go to something that is too complicated, too big, everyone freeze. It's too complicated. I'm here. You ask me to be there. I can't do that. But by providing, little hints, capacity, resilience, practical help, that's really how you get the community to be more resilient. Because at the end of the day, and that's why I wanted to highlight this opening with vulnerable communities, we will all of us not be more secure than the weakest link. That's so true for cyber. So even if corporations are spending a lot of money when it comes to securing themselves, they also know that as long as a third-party supplier, a specific beneficiary, someone is going to be vulnerable, everyone is going to be. And I hope this triggers some interest for question. And thank you very much for having us.